On a Thursday morning, Charles Spencer revealed a single sheet of paper that did what 3 decades of palace image control never could. It shattered the story the public had been told about Princess Diana and Princess Anne. Not in some minor, technical way, not by filling in a few missing pieces. It turned the entire narrative upside down. And the way this surfaced is almost as compelling as what was written in the letter itself. The timing of the release, the exact way the letter had been delivered, and the fact that 2 copies of this document reportedly existed in separate secure locations across England all suggest the same thing. This was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was carefully orchestrated. And according to reports, palace lawyers spent the entire night trying to work out whether they could stop it, only to realize they had no legal basis to intervene. Start with the image of the moment itself, because it feels almost cinematic. Charles Spencer was seated in the library at Althorpe House, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire. And if you have ever seen that room, it looks exactly the way an old English aristocratic library should. Towering windows, endless shelves of leather-bound books, that soft morning light that makes the entire place feel like a scene from a period film. At a heavy walnut desk in front of him sat a mahogany box, freshly brought up from a secure vault buried beneath the foundation of the mansion itself. Not some cabinet tucked away in a basement, a vault beneath the house. He put on white archival gloves, and that detail matters because it tells you immediately this was no casual family keepsake. This was handled as a preserved historical document. He took an iron key, turned it in a brass lock, and opened a silk-lined box containing 1 sheet of pale blue writing paper. The date at the top was August 10th, 1997. And if you know the timeline, that was exactly 21 days before Diana died in Paris. That date changes everything. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of royal analysis and want more deep dives as these stories unfold, subscribe and join us at Royal Decode, because what's emerging now may reshape far more than one chapter of royal history. Now, the letter itself. At the top was the embossed red crest of Kensington Palace. The writing was unmistakably Diana's, done in black rollerball pen. But Charles Spencer did not simply find it and rush it into public view. He reportedly spent 48 hours working with a senior forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives to verify the signature before saying anything publicly. The handwriting, ink pressure, and signature characteristics were compared against hundreds of authenticated letters preserved in the Spencer family archive. That morning, the conclusion came back with no uncertainty at all. Diana's handwriting, Diana's words, Diana's signature. And what she wrote completely destroyed the public story that had surrounded her relationship with Princess Anne for 30 years. For decades, royal biographers and the press pushed the same version of events. Diana and Anne were presented as opposites, even rivals. Diana was cast as glamorous, emotionally open, camera-ready, and internationally adored. Anne was framed as practical, traditional, rural, and uninterested in spectacle. The suggestion was always that they had little in common and kept their distance from one another behind closed doors. But this letter says the opposite. It reveals that during the darkest stretch of Diana's separation, at a time when much of the aristocratic world had already pulled away from her, she turned to Anne as her most trusted source of guidance and protection. Not a socialite, not a celebrity ally, not someone from outside the family. She turned to the king's sister. And even the way she addressed her says a great deal. There were no rigid titles, no formal distance. She simply wrote to Anne in a tone so personal and vulnerable that it exposed how deeply exposed she felt during the summer of 1997. In the letter, Diana described her growing fear over the institutional machinery being used by senior courtiers to manage the public lives of William and Harry. She wrote that she felt an urgent need to create a permanent, independent shield around her son's emotional development. And she said she believed Anne was the only member of the entire Windsor household with the courage to stand up to the palace system. Think about what that means. Diana looked at everyone around her and decided that the one person she believed would truly defend her children was the woman the press had spent years describing as cold, detached, and distant. And then the logistics of the letter make the story even more striking. Diana did not send it through the normal palace channels. She knew, according to the account, that her correspondence was being monitored by the central palace system during that period. So instead, She used what has been described as an informal and highly secretive delivery network used by younger members of the aristocracy to bypass senior courtiers. She instructed her most trusted personal chauffeur to drive the sealed envelope directly to the equestrian stables at Gatcombe Park, Anne's private estate, and hand it personally to Anne's head groom, under strict orders of complete confidentiality. So this was not posted, it was not routed through palace offices, it was not processed by any official department. It went straight from someone Diana trusted to Anne's world, completely outside the reach of palace screening. Before the letter became public, Charles Spencer reportedly gave Clarence House advance notice. His legal team sent a high-resolution copy to the King's private secretary on Wednesday afternoon as a formal courtesy, giving them time to review the contents before the announcement. That single delivery is said to have set off a frantic night inside the palace legal operation. Senior solicitors pored over the 1993 Royal Trust Acts, trying to determine whether the Crown had any legal route to block publication. In the end, they concluded that because the original letter had been found in the private archive at Althorpe, and because it was addressed to a private individual rather than a state official, the Crown had no constitutional authority to suppress it. It fell outside the scope of both the Official Secrets Act and the Royal Collection Trust. In other words, the lawyers had to tell the King's advisors there was nothing they could do. So what exactly was in this letter that caused such alarm? Diana wrote that just 48 hours before sitting down to write, she had learned of a specific administrative document through a trusted source inside the palace registry office. According to her, that leaked paper outlined a confidential plan by senior court officials to restructure her global security arrangements and reduce her personal protection to a minimum. The purpose, as she understood it, was to pressure her into giving up her independent media operations. She described the legal methods being assembled by the King's solicitors as an administrative trap, and she did not write in vague, emotional generalities. She described what she believed was a concrete legal strategy. She said the ultimate aim was to use an old clause within the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a private custody dispute, one that would assert the sovereign's overriding authority over the education, residence, and daily lives of William and Harry. That is not the language of unfocused fear. That is a mother describing a specific institutional threat. What mattered most to her was not her own image, not her travel schedule, and not her public status. She wrote that her deepest terror was what would happen to her sons if she were removed from their everyday upbringing. She described the senior household advisors as functioning like a corporate board, viewing the princes less as growing children in need of love and more as pieces of state machinery. That is an extraordinary accusation, and it becomes even more powerful when you remember who she was writing to. Diana was effectively telling the King's own sister that the family's institutional system would emotionally damage her children unless someone stopped it. The part addressed specifically to Anne is said to be almost painful to read. Diana pleaded with her to see past the manufactured gossip that had been used over the years to keep them apart. She wrote that she had chosen Anne because Anne alone had the courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend the basic rights of a mother. She asked her to become an unbreakable emotional shield between her sons and the traditionalists who wanted to turn them into distant, unfeeling symbols of the state. And the forensic review of the manuscript reportedly revealed something else. Diana had not dashed this off in a moment of emotion. The reverse side of the letter showed multiple edits, crossed out phrases, and revised wording that became sharper and more precise. She was not simply venting. She was constructing a record, carefully enough that it could not later be dismissed as an impulsive outburst. But then, there was one detail that reportedly triggered a new wave of panic inside Buckingham Palace. In the middle of the second page, Diana referred to a hidden personal repository containing more than 200 original letters and diary entries from her school years and early marriage. She wrote that this archive had been stored entirely outside palace control and completely separate from the Royal Archive at Windsor. She also instructed her personal trustees to release the entire collection publicly if the central administration ever attempted to sever her access to her sons after the coming autumn term. That means there may still be a separate vault somewhere, possibly in Fleet Street according to some reports, containing 200 documents Diana intentionally set aside as a safeguard. Palace legal teams are said to have worked through the night trying to trace the movement of Spencer family holdings from that period in an effort to locate the archive before anything else could emerge. That is not a position any palace wants to be in. The letter ended with a postscript Diana added just before sealing the envelope. She wrote that she would be leaving for the Mediterranean the next morning with a profound sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that the time she had left to secure her son's emotional safety was slipping away. 3 weeks later, she was dead. That final note changes the entire nature of the document. It no longer reads like ordinary family correspondence. It reads like something close to a final testimony. Now consider Princess Anne's side of this, because what she reportedly did with that letter over the next 30 years is astonishing. She kept her copy in a fireproof, military-grade combination safe bolted into the stone wall of her private study at Gatcombe Park, concealed beneath equestrian breeding records and family land documents. According to the account, that safe remained untouched by palace aides and household inspectors for exactly 3 decades. And throughout all of it, Anne said nothing. Through the documentaries, the memoirs, the television specials, the tape recordings sold to broadcasters for millions, she gave no interviews, issued no clarifications, and made no attempt to rewrite the public story. She locked the letter away and carried the burden in silence. And when you look at the structure of Anne's royal role, that silence begins to make sense. She has spent her adult life as one of the crown's most deeply traditional figures, someone whose loyalty has always been to continuity and stability, rather than image management or media warfare. She would have understood that exposing a letter alleging internal administrative conspiracy in the late 1990s could have triggered a constitutional firestorm at a moment when the monarchy was already dangerously vulnerable. Public outrage could have derailed the effort to stabilize the institution and directly threatened the future reign of William. So rather than ignite a public confrontation with palace advisors, Anne appears to have chosen a different path. She absorbed the emotional weight of the letter alone and quietly took on the protective role Diana had asked of her. Court circular records are said to support that interpretation. Between 1997 and 2005, Anne reportedly adjusted her charitable and official calendar so that she was regularly present at Windsor during William and Harry's academic breaks. No camera crews, no royal correspondence, no public drama. She simply arrived in her own car, spent time walking with the boys through the quiet paths of the great park, and gave them a stable, grounded space, far from the palace maneuvering surrounding them. While the tabloids painted her as a cold traditionalist untouched by the tragedy, Anne may have been doing exactly what Diana begged her to do. She just never told anyone. Then, according to the account, the secret nearly came to a breaking point in 2026 when palace archivists began preparing for a major national milestone celebration. The master of the household requested a full audit of private correspondence files at Gatcombe Park, intending to transfer any historically sensitive papers to the central repository at Windsor Castle, where they could be screened and restricted under the 50-year privacy rule. Anne reportedly refused immediately. She told registry clerks that the contents of her private safe were personal family papers entirely separate from state administration, and she would not surrender the keys. Palace lawyers soon realized they had no clear legal route to compel a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to hand over her privately inherited correspondence without risking a bitter and deeply damaging internal legal confrontation. So they backed down. The coordination between Charles Spencer and Anne before the public release is another key part of the story. The Earl reportedly traveled by private car to Gloucestershire for an urgent meeting with Anne in her private study. There, he informed her that his legal team had independently authenticated the manuscript discovered at Althorpe, and that he believed the public interest required immediate publication in order to correct the false version of history that had stood for decades. Anne is said to have listened without interruption, her hands resting on the edge of her desk, before finally giving a quiet, formal approval to proceed. She understood that once the Althorpe copy had been fully verified by forensic specialists, any further effort to conceal the duplicate would appear less like caution and more like a palace cover-up. Later that day, her safe was opened so her solicitors could compare her copy against the Althorpe manuscript one final time. The pale blue pages matched exactly. And once the story broke, Buckingham Palace reportedly descended into chaos. More than 300 separate administrative computers across the palace network are said to have opened the high-resolution digital scans uploaded from the Althorp press server. Routine tasks stopped. Diplomatic scheduling paused. Low-level press work was abandoned. Senior media figures gathered around monitoring screens, watching BBC News and Sky News reporters standing outside the palace gates with early print editions featuring front-page analysis of the phrase Diana had written decades earlier: administrative trap. The damage to the palace narrative was immediate and profound. For years, the royal tensions of the 1990s had been packaged as the sad collapse of a private marriage, while millions from the sovereign grant helped project a cleaner image of modern continuity. But the revelation of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne ripped that framing apart. Public polling reportedly showed a sharp surge of sympathy for Anne, with more than 80% of respondents praising her for carrying the burden in silence to protect the young princes. At the same time, public perception of the old administrative guard dropped sharply, because the letter portrayed the palace bureaucracy as something cold, controlling, and more invested in institutional power than human compassion. That created a fresh problem for the communications team. They had reportedly planned to launch a major media push on Friday morning, promoting Queen Camilla's coming charity appearances in London. But after the Althorp letter exploded across headlines, palace media directors realized that proceeding with polished lifestyle coverage while the public was reading a mother's final warning would look painfully tone-deaf. The King's chief secretary froze the entire campaign and ordered the media package locked back into the archive until the storm had passed. Then came the reported phone call between the King's study at Clarence House and Prince William's private office at Adelaide Cottage. According to the account, the King's advisors wanted to prepare a joint family statement. The aim was to acknowledge the historical significance of the letter while gently presenting it as a product of a different era, a reflection of tensions long left behind. They wanted William to sign on to language suggesting the family had moved on from the administrative struggles of 1997. William reportedly refused. During that 20-minute conversation, he told the King's private secretary that he would not allow his staff to take part in any public relations effort meant to soften or reinterpret his mother's own handwritten words. He said the note revealed by Charles Spencer was a genuine part of his family's history, and that he respected the silence his Aunt Anne had maintained for 30 years in order to protect his childhood. By refusing to support the palace's defensive messaging, William effectively left the King's advisors exposed to the full force of public scrutiny. And the atmosphere inside the palace press office that afternoon said everything about how unprepared they had been. The phones would not stop ringing. Journalists from around the world wanted to know whether the Crown would open a formal investigation into the hidden archive Diana had referenced. The press secretaries had no meaningful response. All they could do was repeat a dry statement about the private nature of historical family papers, their voices reportedly strained under the pressure of a revelation that palace discipline could not contain. The final official verification was reportedly entered into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. A senior archivist applied digital encryption markers to the newly processed file and placed it into the permanent National Historical Record. The original 1997 Kensington Palace paper, pale blue and handwritten, is now said to be officially registered in the Public Archive of the State, preserved in a secure, climate-controlled archival case where it is protected from any future attempt at censorship or administrative tampering. Outside the railings of Buckingham Palace, thousands stood silently holding evening newspapers featuring full-page reproductions of Diana's slanted handwriting. Polling that night reportedly showed more than 90% of respondents expressing deep gratitude for the role Anne had played in protecting the princes. So where does that leave the modern court? It leaves King Charles's central administration confronting the fact that 30 years of careful narrative management have been undone by a single sheet of paper pulled from a vault at Althorp. It leaves William's future court at Adelaide Cottage largely untouched by the fallout, because the public now sees his modern approach to royal life as closely aligned with the emotional blueprint his mother fought to preserve. The old guard has been pushed into silence, and Princess Anne, the woman tabloid culture spent decades portraying as distant and unfeeling, has emerged as the person Diana trusted most to shield her children from the machinery of the institution itself. This was not just a forgotten letter from the past. It was a voice returning across decades to rewrite royal history in a single stroke.